I want to tell you something tonight I've never said out loud before, not even to my own daughter. There was a night, an entirely ordinary night, nothing marked on any calendar, when I stood in my kitchen and did something that felt, at the time, like the smallest act of my whole life. And it turned out to be one of the largest. I set out 2 cups by the kettle, the way I did every single morning without deciding to, the way you might tie your shoes or lock a door. Cream in one, nothing in the other, because that's how he liked his. And then I stood there, hands still on the counter, and something in me simply stopped. I looked at that second cup for a long moment, and I put it back in the cupboard. That's it. That's the whole story. On the surface of it, a woman puts a cup away. But if you've lived even a little of what I've lived, you already know it wasn't about the cup at all. If you've caught yourself doing something similar, setting out 2 plates before you remember, reaching for the phone to call someone who won't answer, keeping a coat on a hook by the door long after there was any reason to. I want you to know that what I'm about to share tonight was written with exactly that moment of yours in mind. Pull your chair a little closer to the fire. Tonight isn't about grief in the way you've heard it talked about before, the getting through it, the 5 stages, the well-meaning cards that tell you time heals everything. Tonight is about something quieter, and I think far more honest, the specific night, whenever it comes for you, when waiting turns into something else, when the part of you that has been holding a place at the table finally, gently sets it down. None of what I'm about to say assumes you're ready for that night yet. Maybe you are. Maybe you're nowhere close, and that is entirely, completely all right. There is no schedule for this. Anyone who tells you there's a schedule for this has never actually lived through it. But I do want you to know it's possible. Because for a long while, if I'm honest, I didn't think it was. You know this particular kind of waiting, even if you've never called it by that name. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's in the way you still glance at the door when a car pulls into the driveway, some old reflex faster than thought. It's in the way you keep the volume on the television a little louder than you need it, just so the house doesn't sound quite so much like a house with only one person breathing in it. It's in the way you've read that last voicemail he left, or she left. So many times you could recite it, and yet you still can't quite bring yourself to delete it, because deleting it feels like agreeing that he's really gone. I know that quiet. I lived inside it for longer than I like to admit. A woman wrote to me not long ago, describing a version of this that has stayed with me ever since. She told me she still set her husband's toothbrush out beside hers every night before bed, years after he was gone, not because she believed he was coming back, but because the bathroom counter looked unbearably bare without it. She said she felt foolish admitting it, as though a grown woman should have outgrown something so small. I want to tell you what I told her, because I think it belongs here too. There is nothing foolish about it. What she was describing wasn't confusion about whether he was gone. It was love, still looking for somewhere to put itself down. What happened for her, once she understood that, wasn't at all what she expected. And I promise, we'll come back to her story a little later tonight, because it isn't finished yet. Maybe yours isn't a cup or a coat at all. Maybe it's the way you still write 2 names on the Christmas card envelope out of pure muscle memory, catching yourself only after the pen has already moved. Maybe it's the passenger seat you keep clear of bags and groceries out of some old courtesy nobody asked you to keep. Whatever the specific shape of it is for you, I want you to know it isn't strange, and it certainly isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It's simply what a devoted heart does when it hasn't yet been given permission to set its devotion down somewhere new. There is a particular ache that comes not from the loss itself, but from all the small daily rituals that outlive the person they were built for. The extra chair pulled up to the table on holidays. The Sunday drive you still find yourself dressed for. Before you remember there's nowhere to drive to anymore, and no one beside you to drive with. The side of the closet you haven't touched. Not because you're incapable of it, but because touching it feels like a kind of second funeral. One nobody else attends. One you have to hold entirely by yourself. None of this is your fault. I want to say that plainly, because I don't think anyone said it to me plainly enough, back when I needed to hear it. The waiting isn't weakness. It isn't you failing to grieve correctly, whatever that would even mean. The waiting is love with nowhere left to go, and love, it turns out, life doesn't simply stop moving just because the person it was aimed at has left the room. It keeps moving. It just has to find a new direction. And that takes time. Nobody can rush for you, least of all yourself. But here is the thing I need you to sit with tonight, the thing that took me far too long to understand. There is a difference between honoring what you lost and living permanently inside the waiting for it to return. One of those keeps his memory warm, the other keeps you frozen. And for the longest time, I couldn't tell which one I was doing. I want to walk you through exactly how I finally could. But before I do, there's something underneath all of this that I think you deserve to understand first, because once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. And I promise you, that's a good thing. Carl Jung, a man who spent his whole life studying what happens inside the human psyche during exactly this kind of long, quiet aftermath, had a word for what I was living through without knowing its name. We'll come back to that word in a moment, because first, I want to tell you what actually happened the morning after I put that second cup away. It didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think too many people rush the ending of stories like this one, make it sound like a door swinging open into sunlight. It wasn't like that. I felt strange, almost guilty, if I'm being completely truthful, the way you feel when you've done something necessary that still doesn't sit easily in your chest. I stood in that kitchen with one cup instead of two, and I wondered quietly whether I had just betrayed him. That question sat with me for weeks, and I think it might be sitting with you right now, in some form, about something of your own. So before I tell you what I eventually understood, I want you to hold that question with me a little longer, because the answer isn't what you'd expect, and it changed the way I understood everything that came after. If you've stayed with me this far, what comes next was written with you specifically in mind. Here is the complication nobody warns you about ahead of time. Waiting, in the early months and sometimes years, actually feels like devotion. It feels like the responsible thing, the loyal thing, the thing a good wife or husband or partner does. You tell yourself that stopping the waiting means stopping the love. And so you keep the 2 cups by the kettle. You keep the extra chair at the table. You keep glancing at the driveway. Because some part of you has quietly decided that if you ever fully stop, it will mean he never mattered as much as he did. I want to be very clear with you about something. That belief, understandable as it is not true. And carrying it any longer than you need to isn't loyalty. It's a kind of self-punishment dressed up in loyalty's clothes, and you didn't choose to put it on. It was handed to you, quietly, by grief itself, in those first raw months when you needed something, anything, to hold on to. And holding on to the waiting felt safer than facing the alternative. The woman who wrote to me about the toothbrush told me something else, further down in her letter. She said the hardest part wasn't the ritual itself, but what people around her assumed it meant. Her sister had gently suggested it might be time to move things along. Her own daughter had gone quiet on the subject entirely, unsure how to bring it up. Nobody was unkind about it, but she said she felt more and more like she was grieving in a way that made other people uncomfortable, and so she started hiding it, doing the ritual privately, almost secretly, as though loving her husband too visibly for too long had become something to apologize for. I don't think you should ever have to apologize for the shape your love takes, however long it lingers, however small the ritual. But I also think there's a difference, and this is the part she eventually found her way to, between a ritual that is quietly comforting you and one that has become the entire architecture holding your grief in place, so that you can't actually move without knocking the whole structure down. Telling those two apart is exactly what I want to help you do tonight. This is where I think it helps enormously to understand what's actually happening underneath, in plain terms, without any of the clinical language that makes this feel more distant and complicated than it needs to be. Jung used the word complex to describe exactly this kind of automatic pattern, a groove worn so deep into you by repetition and pain that it starts running on its own, without your permission, without you even deciding to run it. The reaching for the second cup wasn't a decision each morning. It was a complex, operating quietly beneath your conscious choosing, keeping a version of him present in the smallest architecture of your day. There's no shame whatsoever in that. A complex isn't a character flaw. It's simply what the mind does to survive a wound too large to process all at once. But here's what matters most. the part I think you most need to hear tonight. A complex that was once protective can become, over time, a complex that quietly keeps you smaller than you actually are. And there is a way to gently loosen its grip without ever having to pretend the loss didn't happen, without ever having to love him or her 1 ounce less. Jung also wrote about something called the persona, the mask, the role we learn to wear so the people around us know how to relate to us. For many of the women I hear from, there's a particular persona that quietly forms in the wake of loss. The grieving widow, the woman who is still, in some sense, waiting. It's a role that earns sympathy, that feels safe, that nobody questions. Friends handle you gently inside it. Family doesn't push. And so, without meaning to, some part of you learns to keep wearing it, long after the raw grief underneath it has actually begun to soften into something quieter. I wore that persona for longer than the pain underneath it actually lasted. I think, if I'm honest, I wore it partly because I was afraid of who I'd be without it. If I wasn't the widow who was still waiting, who was I? That question terrified me more than the grief itself ever did. There's a companion to the persona that Jung wrote about too, one worth naming gently here, because I think it explains why letting go of a ritual like the second cup can feel so much larger than the object itself. He called it the shadow, the parts of ourselves we set aside, often for good reasons at the time, to keep the people around us comfortable, to keep the peace, to keep functioning. For many women I hear from, an entire self got quietly shelved somewhere in those first hard years, the version of her who wanted things for herself, who took up a little room in a conversation, who occasionally put her own evening ahead of everyone else's. That woman didn't disappear. She was simply set aside while you did the enormous work of surviving something unsurvivable. And she is usually still there, patiently, waiting for you to notice her again, which, if you think about it, is a far gentler kind of waiting than the one we've been talking about tonight. So why does letting go of the waiting feel more frightening at night than it does during the day, when the house is busy with errands and phone calls and the ordinary noise of living? Hold on to that question, because it matters, and I think the answer will surprise you. It's frightening at night, because night is when the persona has nothing left to perform for, no neighbor to be brave in front of, no errand to distract you. Just you, the quiet, and the truth underneath the mask, whatever that truth happens to be that particular evening. That's usually when the real question surfaces, not am I grieving correctly, but who am I now if I'm not the one still waiting? I don't have a tidy answer for you tonight, because there isn't one, not really. But I can tell you what I found on the other side of that question, and I think it might be the most important thing I share with you this evening. Jung described something called enantiodromia, a strange, almost paradoxical law he noticed again and again in the human psyche, where anything pushed to its extreme eventually reverses into its opposite. Grief carried far enough, held honestly enough, doesn't simply fade with time the way people promise you it will. It transforms. The very depth of the waiting, the very intensity of the ache, is what eventually turns, on its own, into a kind of hard-won peace, not because the love disappeared, but because love that has been fully felt, fully honored, doesn't need to keep proving itself through waiting anymore. It settles. It becomes part of you, instead of a task you perform. This isn't the end of what you shared with him or her. It's the beginning of your individuation, the slow, deeply personal process of becoming fully, undividedly yourself, which Jung believed intensifies precisely in the second half of life, and which very often has to move directly through a season exactly like the one you might be sitting inside right now. You might be telling yourself it's too late for that you've been waiting too long to change now, that this is simply who you've become. It isn't. I promise you, from the other side of it, it isn't. You might also be telling yourself that letting go of the ritual means letting go of him. It doesn't. What happened next in my own story isn't what you'd expect, and I think it might be exactly what you need to hear. The morning after I put that cup away, I still thought about him within the first minute of waking, the way I had every morning since. That never stopped, and I don't believe it ever fully will, nor do I think it should. But that afternoon, doing something as small as watering the plant on my windowsill, I caught myself humming an old song, one we used to dance to badly in the kitchen decades ago. I hadn't hummed anything in longer than I could remember, and instead of the guilt I expected to feel, I felt him there with me in it, lighter than he'd felt in ages, like he'd finally stopped being someone I was losing and started being someone I simply, permanently carried. The woman with the toothbrush, the one I told you about earlier, wrote to me again a few months after that first letter. She said she'd finally moved it. Not thrown it away, just moved it into the drawer beneath the sink, somewhere close, but no longer on display for guilt to feed on every morning. She said the first few days felt like a small grief all over again, and then, unexpectedly, like relief. She started leaving her own things out on the counter instead, her reading glasses, a little dish for her rings, and said the bathroom finally looked like somewhere a whole, particular woman lived, rather than a shrine to an absence. That is not betrayal. That is what healing actually looks like up close, and it rarely looks like the tidy ending we're promised in advance. That is the harder part I needed you to understand before the way through would actually make sense. The waiting and the remembering are not the same thing. You can release one completely and keep the other forever. Nobody tells you that distinction exists, and so you white-knuckle the waiting because you're terrified that letting it go means losing him all over again. It doesn't. It only means you finally stop performing a version of loyalty that was quietly exhausting you in favor of a version that actually lets you breathe. By the end of tonight, I think something in your chest is going to feel a little lighter. Let's get there together, because there's still a piece of this I haven't told you yet. Something is already shifting in you, right now, tonight, even if you can't quite name what it is yet. I felt it too. In the weeks before that morning with the cup, a kind of restlessness underneath the grief, like a coat that no longer fit quite the way it used to. If you've noticed something like that in yourself lately, an evening that felt a little less unbearable than the ones before it, a memory that made you smile before it made you ache, that isn't you forgetting him. That's the enantiodromia I mentioned, quietly doing its work, turning the depth of what you carried into the beginning of something gentler. I want you to picture, just for a moment, an ordinary evening a little further down this road than you are tonight. Picture yourself in your own kitchen, whatever it looks like, at whatever hour feels most like yours. There's a cup in your hand, one cup, and it doesn't feel like an absence anymore. It feels like yours. Maybe there's a window catching the last low gold light of the day, and you find yourself standing there a moment longer than necessary. Not because you're waiting for anyone, but because the moment itself, just as it is, feels worth staying in. Maybe you've set the table properly again, for yourself, with a real plate and a lit candle, not because anyone is coming, but because you decided quietly that you were worth the trouble. The house around you is still quiet in places. It probably always will be, in places. But the quiet has stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like a room you know how to live inside. Maybe, in that evening, the driveway outside your window stops being something you watch out of habit and simply becomes a driveway again, ordinary, unremarkable, no longer a small stage for an old reflex. Maybe the coat comes off the hook, not thrown away, just moved somewhere. It can be visited on purpose, instead of brushed past every single day like an unhealed nerve. You might find, the way I did, that the ache doesn't vanish so much as it moves, settling from your chest down into something steadier, something you can carry while still standing upright, while still laughing at something on the television, while still, every so often, humming. That evening is not a guarantee I can hand you tonight, and I would never pretend it is. Nobody can promise you a feeling on a schedule, and I won't insult you by trying. But I can tell you it is possible, because I am standing in a version of it myself most nights now, and I promise you, if I could find my way there, so can you. You might be telling yourself that you're not the kind of person who moves through grief that way, that some women heal and others simply carry it forever, and you already know which one you are. I don't believe that's true, and I don't think you fully believe it either. Not the part of you that clicked on this video tonight looking for exactly this conversation. Here is what I want you to actually do, starting tonight, not someday, not when you feel ready, because readiness has a way of never quite arriving on its own. Choose one small ritual, just one, that has been quietly keeping the waiting alive, the extra cup, the coat on the hook, the seat left empty at a table that doesn't need it anymore, and change it gently, on purpose, this week. You don't have to throw anything away. You don't have to erase a single memory. Simply do the smallest version of what I did with that cup. Notice the ritual. Thank it for what it gave you when you needed it, and then quietly let it become something new. If it helps, write down, just for yourself, what that one ritual has been quietly protecting you from. Not to analyze it, and certainly not to judge it, just to see it clearly in your own handwriting. So it stops operating in the dark and starts becoming something you're choosing on purpose, rather than something simply happening to you every morning before you've even had your coffee. If this is your story too, I would be honored to hear it. What's the ritual that's been quietly keeping your own waiting alive? Tell me about it below, whatever it is, however small it seems to you. If you're watching this tonight with a cup of tea cooling on the table beside you, I'd love to know where you're joining me from. I read every comment, every single one, usually with my own cup in hand. You are so far from the only one carrying something like this tonight. If any part of this found its way into your chest, tell me so in the comments, and let's remind each other we're not doing this alone. And if tonight's story shifted something in how you're thinking about your own waiting, even just slightly, I would love to know what it was. We've walked through a lot together tonight, the cup by the kettle, the persona that kept me waiting long after the raw grief had softened, the complex running quietly underneath my mornings, and the strange, hopeful law Jung called enantiodromia, where the deepest grief, fully felt, eventually turns into something gentler than either of us expected. None of that erases what you lost. None of it asks you to love anyone less. It only asks you to notice which of your rituals are honoring your love and which ones have quietly become a cage built entirely out of loyalty. Come back and sit with me again tomorrow night. There's more by this fire I still want to share with you, and I'll be right here waiting, in the good way this time. This isn't about forgetting a single detail of the life you built together. It's about letting the love finally settle into something that can hold both of you at once, without exhausting you in the process. The memory kept warm on one side, and a whole, particular woman still very much living on the other. That balance doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives one small, deliberate choice at a time, the way mine arrived the morning I put a single cup back in the cupboard, and, to my own surprise, felt him standing closer to me for it, not farther away. You are not behind. You are not betraying anyone by finding peace. You are quietly and completely allowed to set the table for one and still call it a full life.